Jake, a seasoned security professional, had a keen eye for details. He could read people, picking up on the smallest gestures, the slightest changes in expression, and those quick glances that often spoke louder than words. Working at Richard's mansion, he'd always found Emily, Richard's wife, to be composed and poised. However, over the past few weeks, he'd noticed a change in her demeanor. She seemed restless, constantly checking her phone, responding to messages with an urgency that was out of character. Jake had witnessed her acting secretively, especially during quiet moments when she thought no one was watching. One particular evening, as he passed by the study, he overheard Emily speaking in a hushed tone on the phone. Her words were barely audible, but certain phrases caught his attention. Things like, "tomorrow afternoon," and "we need to be careful." Although Jake knew he shouldn't be eavesdropping, something about her voice held a sense of urgency, as if she was involved in something beyond the ordinary. The next day, Jake decided to follow his instincts. If Emily was hiding something, he intended to find out what it was. When she left the house, he discreetly followed her car through the busy streets of New York. He maintained a safe distance, driving carefully as she wove her way through the city. Eventually, she parked near a chic cafe and walked inside. Jake followed her gaze through the large glass windows of the cafe, spotting her meeting with a tall, well-dressed man. They greeted each other with a brief hug, a gesture that looked more intimate than friendly. As they sat together in a corner booth, Jake observed the way they interacted, how she smiled at him, leaned in to speak closely, her expression filled with an excitement he'd never seen when she was around Richard. The scene felt like a puzzle piece he'd stumbled upon, one that hinted at something deeper than mere friendship. Jake knew he had to keep an eye on them, so he stayed in his car, taking photos discreetly to document the encounter. If there was any truth to his suspicions, he would need evidence before bringing this to Richard. Returning to the mansion, Jake found himself wrestling with a decision. Should he tell Richard what he'd seen? He felt torn between his duty and his conscience. On one hand, his loyalty to Richard compelled him to reveal Emily's potential betrayal. But on the other, he was still uncertain. Meeting someone in a cafe didn't necessarily mean she was having an affair. Yet, the look in Emily's eyes, the way she behaved around that man, hinted at a connection that went beyond simple friendship. Jake hesitated, ultimately deciding to hold off on saying anything until he had more proof. He knew that accusing Emily without hard evidence could backfire, potentially costing him his job. But deep down, he felt that this was only the beginning. His gut told him there was more to Emily's secret life, and he intended to uncover every detail, no matter what it took. Secrets, after all, had a way of coming to light, and Jake was determined to be the one who revealed them. The next day, Jake's mind was still occupied by what he'd witnessed. He decided he needed to speak to Richard directly. He found him in the office, staring intently at a set of financial reports on his desk. Jake approached him cautiously, knowing that Richard wasn't one to take interruptions lightly, especially when they concerned his personal life. Nonetheless, Jake felt it was his duty to share what he'd seen. "Sir, I need to talk to you about Emily," Jake began, his tone serious. Richard glanced up, frowning slightly. Jake explained what he had observed, choosing his words carefully. He mentioned Emily's unusual behavior, her secretive phone calls, and the meeting with the man at the cafe. Richard, however, seemed unfazed. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with an air of irritation. "Jake, you're paid to protect me, not to spy on my wife. Emily has her own life, and if she wants to meet someone for coffee, that's her business," he replied dismissively. Richard waved a hand as if to brush off Jake's concerns entirely. Despite his nonchalant tone, Jake saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of doubt perhaps, or a hint of defensiveness. But Richard wasn't ready to address it. He instructed Jake to return to his duties, ending the conversation abruptly. Feeling dismissed, Jake walked away. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's indifference was just a mask. He sensed that beneath Richard's cool exterior lay a man grappling with questions he didn't want to confront. Nonetheless, Jake knew he couldn't let this go. He resolved to gather more information before approaching him again. The following morning, while making his rounds, Jake noticed a brand new sports car in the mansion's garage. The sleek, red Ferrari gleamed under the garage lights, its aggressive lines and luxurious finish standing out among the other cars. Surprised, he checked the documents inside and found that it was registered in Emily's name. This detail struck him as odd. Emily didn't have a history of extravagant purchases, especially not ones like this. A vehicle of such caliber suggested a bold statement, one of wealth and freedom, far from her usual subtle tastes. Jake wondered if the car had anything to do with the man she'd met. Maybe it was a gift, or worse, a symbol of some new chapter in her life. The sight of the car added fuel to Jake's suspicions, strengthening his resolve to dig deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's life was taking a new direction, and whatever it was, it seemed to involve more than just an affair. It hinted at something larger, possibly more dangerous. This car, he felt, was a clue, an outward sign of whatever internal shift was driving her behavior. Later that day, Richard came down to the garage, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the car. For a moment, he just stared at it, his fingers tracing along the glossy surface. Jake saw an opportunity to approach him, and without hesitation, he spoke up. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice the car. It's not Emily's usual style." Richard glanced at Jake, his expression hardening. "Do you think I don't know that?" he snapped, but then his voice softened, as if contemplating something. "It's hers, all right, but I didn't buy it for her. She must have done it herself, or someone else did." Richard's gaze turned distant, as if the reality of the situation was finally starting to settle in. Jake took a step closer. "I think there's more going on than meets the eye, sir. I don't want to overstep, but maybe we need to look into this together." For a brief moment, Richard considered his words. Then he nodded slowly, his face tightening with a newfound resolve. He finally seemed willing to confront the situation head-on. "All right, Jake," Richard replied. "Find out who that man is, and get me the truth about what's happening here. If there's one thing I don't tolerate, it's deception." With those words, Richard walked away, leaving Jake with a clear mission. He now had Richard's permission to dig deeper, and he intended to leave no stone unturned. The game had changed, and Jake knew that whatever lay ahead would not only reveal the truth about Emily, but also challenge everything he thought he understood about loyalty and trust. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake made it his mission to follow Emily more closely. He knew he had to be careful. She was sharp and observant, and any sign of him trailing her might spook her into hiding whatever she was up to. He waited for the perfect moment, watching as she left the mansion one afternoon, looking more polished than usual, dressed in a designer coat and high heels. She drove through the city, finally parking in front of an upscale boutique on Madison Avenue. Jake parked a block away, following on foot from a distance, blending into the crowded sidewalk. Inside the boutique, Jake watched through the store windows as Emily was soon joined by the same man he'd seen before. They exchanged a familiar smile before moving to the back of the store, away from prying eyes. Jake circled to another window, peering inside to catch a better glimpse of them. The man was showing her an expensive dress, holding it up against her while she laughed, touching his arm in a way that suggested an intimacy beyond mere friendship. Jake captured a few photos, hoping they would be enough to convey the seriousness of what he was discovering. It was clear now that Emily wasn't just having a casual rendezvous. She was deeply involved with this man, and their interactions hinted at a bond both personal and possibly business-related. That evening, Jake returned to the mansion with his findings, knowing it was time to confront Richard again. He waited until Richard was alone in his study before presenting the photos he had taken at the boutique. Richard looked at the images silently, his jaw clenched as he examined each one. The photos didn't lie. Emily and the man looked like a couple, comfortable and close, as if they'd been together for years. Richard's face was an expressionless mask, but Jake could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. "So she's been meeting him in secret," Richard murmured, almost to himself. His hand tightened around the edge of his desk as he continued to stare at the photos. "Do you know who he is?" he asked, his voice controlled but laced with tension. "Not yet, but I'm working on it," Jake replied. "He seems to have connections in high places. I'll find out who he is and what he wants." Richard nodded, a dangerous glint in his eyes, and leaned back in his chair, as if calculating his next move. He seemed resigned but also resolute, as though he'd been expecting something like this all along. Jake could tell that Richard was finally ready to take action, no longer willing to ignore the signs that had been so blatantly in front of him. Over the following days, Jake dedicated himself to learning more about the man who had become such an influential figure in Emily's life. He discovered that the man, whose name was Matthew Kane, was a successful entrepreneur with deep connections in the tech industry. His reputation in New York's elite circles was impeccable, but rumors hinted at a darker side, a man willing to bend the rules to secure his power and wealth. Digging deeper, Jake found that Matthew was closely involved with a group of investors who had been eyeing Richard's company, a circle of influential figures known for taking down competitors by any means necessary. Jake's investigation revealed something even more troubling. Matthew was not only trying to get close to Emily, but seemed to have a larger agenda. Jake suspected that he might be using his relationship with Emily as leverage, hoping to gain inside information about Richard's business dealings. As he pieced together the puzzle, Jake felt a growing unease. This was more than just an affair. It was a calculated move to infiltrate Richard's life and possibly undermine his company. Despite the personal stakes, Jake felt himself caught in a conflict of loyalty. He had always respected Richard, but his feelings for Emily complicated things. He found himself drawn to her, feeling a strange mix of protectiveness and jealousy. As he delved deeper into Matthew's connections, he wondered whether Emily was truly complicit in the scheme or if she was being manipulated by a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. Torn between his duty and his emotions, Jake knew he had to press on. The truth was still out there, buried beneath layers of deception, and he was determined to uncover it, even if it meant confronting his own conflicting desires. With Jake's investigation underway, Richard decided he needed to see the truth with his own eyes. Late one evening, he followed Emily as she slipped out of the mansion and drove into the heart of Manhattan. He kept his distance, navigating the crowded streets carefully until she parked in front of an upscale office building. Richard watched as she entered, noticing how she glanced around before stepping through the doors. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored suit appeared. He recognized him from the photos Jake had shown, Matthew Kane. As Emily and Matthew disappeared inside, Richard felt a surge of anger mixed with a pang of betrayal. He'd spent years building a life for them, believing in their partnership. Now he realized that Emily was tangled up with someone who posed a genuine threat, not only to their marriage, but also to his business. Richard decided to dig deeper. If Emily was involved in some plot, he needed to know how far it went, and whether it threatened the empire he'd worked so hard to build. The next day, Jake's investigation uncovered an unsettling piece of information. Matthew Kane was connected to a shadowy group of investors, one with a reputation for aggressive takeovers. Richard's company was their next target, and they seemed willing to exploit any weakness they could find. By using Emily, Matthew was trying to gain access to inside information, potentially sabotaging Richard's business from the inside. Jake shared his findings with Richard, laying out a series of documents he'd gathered, evidence of meetings between Matthew and members of this investor group, as well as their interest in Richard's company. As Richard pored over the documents, Jake could see the realization dawning on him. This wasn't just about Emily's betrayal. It was a calculated conspiracy to destroy him. "We have to be careful," Jake warned. "These people don't play by the rules. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. Emily might be just the beginning." Richard nodded, his expression hardened. "Then we'll play their game. If they think they can use my wife against me, they've underestimated me. Let's keep this quiet for now. We'll gather more evidence and expose them when the time is right." Jake and Richard decided to work together, pooling their resources to uncover the full extent of the plot. Richard, now aware of the stakes, began looking at his interactions with Emily differently. He realized that in order to protect his company, he needed to protect himself from the people closest to him, even if that included his own wife. Emily had become a vulnerability, and he needed to understand whether she was a willing participant in Matthew's scheme or an unwitting pawn. Their investigation led them to Matthew's business connections. They discovered that his company had been targeting Richard's for months, staging a takeover that could devastate Richard's financial empire. But the most shocking revelation was that Emily might have been involved from the beginning, her relationship with Matthew going back further than either Jake or Richard had suspected. This realization stung Richard deeply, but it also fueled his resolve to dismantle the conspiracy piece by piece. Now, Jake's role became even more critical. His assignment wasn't just about protecting Richard. It was about ensuring that every move they made was calculated and precise. Together, they mapped out a plan to monitor Matthew and expose the network of investors who were funding him. As Richard and Jake dove deeper into the conspiracy, they found themselves uncovering a labyrinth of secrets that stretched beyond the betrayal in Richard's marriage, threatening to bring down everyone involved. With the game now fully in motion, Jake knew that they would have to be relentless. They couldn't afford mistakes, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Whatever lay ahead, he was prepared to follow it to the end, knowing that the truth would come at a cost. As their investigation progressed, Richard and Jake formulated a plan to expose Emily and Matthew publicly. They decided that the perfect opportunity would be an upcoming gala, an annual event that gathered the city's most influential figures, hosted by Richard himself. It was a place where secrets could be revealed with devastating consequences, and the stakes would be as high as they could get. They spent days planning every detail, making sure that no one would suspect what was coming. On the night of the gala, Jake ensured security was tight and arranged for a few trusted guards to be ready for what might unfold. Richard, dressed impeccably in a custom suit, mingled with guests, greeting friends and business associates as though nothing was amiss. Jake watched from a distance, keeping a close eye on Emily, who arrived with Matthew, both looking every bit the picture of elegance and charm. She was unaware that the evening's events had been orchestrated to bring her secrets into the open. As the night progressed, Richard moved through the crowd, greeting guests and maintaining a facade of calm. Meanwhile, Jake kept a close watch on Emily and Matthew as they circulated, mingling with other attendees and making connections with potential allies. But the time for subtlety was over. Jake nodded to Richard, signaling that everything was in place for the confrontation. Richard called for the room's attention, standing on the raised platform with a glass of champagne in hand. The crowd fell silent, expecting him to make a toast or announce some new business venture. Instead, Richard began speaking about loyalty, trust, and the hidden dangers of betrayal. His tone was sharp, his words heavy with a meaning that everyone in the room could sense but only a few truly understood. As he spoke, he directed his gaze towards Emily, who stood frozen next to Matthew, a look of dawning horror on her face. In business, as in life, loyalty is everything. When someone you trust turns against you, it's a deeper wound than any rival could inflict, Richard said, his voice cutting through the silence. Then, Without breaking his gaze, he motioned to Jake, who stepped forward with a set of documents and photographs, the evidence they had gathered over the past weeks. Jake displayed the photos of Emily and Matthew together, their intimate moments captured and now exposed for all to see. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the crowd processed the implications of what they were witnessing. Emily's face drained of color, and Matthew's calm demeanor slipped as he realized the gravity of the situation. Richard continued, detailing how Matthew and a group of investors had plotted to dismantle his company, using Emily as their point of access. Emily tried to protest, her voice breaking as she attempted to deny the accusations. But the evidence was irrefutable. Richard's expression remained cold as he watched her, his silence more devastating than any words. Matthew, realizing that his plans were crumbling, attempted to escape, but Jake had prepared for this possibility. The guards moved swiftly, blocking Matthew's path and ensuring he had no way out. Jake approached him, his eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction as he watched Matthew realize the trap he had walked into. In a final act, Richard addressed the guests, revealing the depths of the conspiracy that had nearly torn apart his life and his business. He made it clear that while he valued loyalty, he also understood the importance of standing up to betrayal with unwavering resolve. To anyone who thinks they can deceive me or undermine what I've built, consider this a warning, he declared, his voice steady and commanding. With that, he walked away from the stage, leaving Emily and Matthew exposed before the crowd, the weight of their actions bearing down on them as the guests looked on in judgment. Jake felt a sense of closure as the guards led Matthew away, knowing that he had fulfilled his duty. Yet, as he glanced at Emily, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. Despite everything, a part of him had hoped that things would turn out differently, but the truth had been laid bare, and now they all had to face the consequences of the choices they had made. As the guests whispered among themselves, Richard stepped down from the platform, facing Emily with a look of cold finality. The room fell silent as he addressed her, his voice low but resolute. "I trusted you, Emily. I built a life with you, and you used that trust to betray me." His words echoed in the silence, and everyone present could feel the weight of his disappointment. Emily stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. She struggled to find the right words, but none came. For the first time that evening, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. In that moment, Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her, despite everything he'd learned. However, he knew that the sympathy he felt didn't change the reality of her actions. She had chosen her path, and now she had to confront the consequences. Richard turned his back on her, signaling that he had nothing more to say. Jake watched as Emily, in a last-ditch effort, tried to reach for Richard's arm, pleading with him to listen. But he stepped away, his face impassive, leaving her standing alone, exposed before the crowd. Jake stepped forward, breaking the tension by addressing the room. He spoke of the investigation he and Richard had conducted, carefully laying out the connections they had uncovered between Matthew, the group of investors, and Emily's involvement. He explained that the conspiracy had been meticulously planned, an effort not only to disrupt Richard's personal life, but also to dismantle his company from within. The guests listened in stunned silence as Jake recounted the evidence they had gathered, presenting Emily's role as both a betrayal of her marriage and a threat to Richard's business. Then, in a surprising move, Jake turned to Matthew, who had been cornered by security guards. "You tried to manipulate the wrong man," Jake said, his voice calm, yet carrying a hint of warning. "And now you're going to face the consequences of that mistake." The guards tightened their grip on Matthew, who looked around desperately, realizing that his influence and connections wouldn't save him this time. Emily tried to speak, attempting to defend herself, but Jake cut her off, revealing everything he knew. He shared how he had followed her, how he had discovered her secret meetings, and how her actions had fueled the entire conspiracy. It was a moment of raw exposure, one that left Emily visibly shaken. The room remained quiet as Jake finished speaking, and he could feel the eyes of the guests upon him, sensing their judgment and their shock. Matthew, seeing that escape was impossible, made a final attempt to assert his innocence, claiming that Emily had been a willing participant, fully aware of the plans against Richard. Emily, in turn, denied his accusations, insisting that she had been coerced, trapped by Matthew's manipulations and empty promises. The confrontation escalated, with both of them trying to shift the blame, their once united front now crumbling under the weight of betrayal and fear. Jake had anticipated this, and he had prepared accordingly. At his signal, the guards produced a series of documents that outlined the network of transactions linking Matthew's accounts to those of the investors who had funded the scheme. The evidence was irrefutable, laying bare the depths of Matthew's manipulation and the extent of his ambitions. The final nail in the coffin came when Jake revealed recordings he had obtained, capturing Matthew's conversations with the investors, discussing their plans to take over Richard's company. The guests gasped as the guards moved to escort Matthew out, sealing his fate. Emily, left alone in the wake of the chaos, realized that her pleas would go unanswered. Jake stepped back, letting the moment settle, knowing that the truth had finally been exposed. Richard, standing amidst the ruins of his marriage and the remnants of a conspiracy that had almost destroyed him, turned to Jake with a look of gratitude and respect. With the truth laid bare, the room remained silent, each person grappling with the gravity of what they had witnessed. Emily was left to confront the choices that had brought her to this point, while Matthew was led away, his schemes unraveled and his power shattered. As the guests began to disperse, the whispers of scandal and betrayal filled the air, and Jake knew that, while the evening had ended, the repercussions of these revelations were only just beginning. With the gala's aftermath lingering in the air, Richard found himself confronting the reality of Emily's betrayal and Matthew's conspiracy. In his study, surrounded by the silence of his empty mansion, he replayed the events of the night in his mind. Jake joined him, aware of the difficult emotions his employer was processing. They sat across from one another, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard broke the silence. "I need to know why, Jake. Why would she do this? Was it for the money, for power, or was it something else entirely?" Richard's voice, though steady, carried a hint of vulnerability that Jake hadn't heard before. Jake took a deep breath before responding. "Sir, I believe she got caught up in something she couldn't control. Matthew used her, manipulated her, and then when she tried to pull back, it was already too late. She was likely coerced, drawn into his plans before she understood their full impact." Richard nodded, though his expression showed no relief. "I need to know how deep her involvement goes," he replied. He was no longer just a betrayed husband. He was a man determined to reclaim his life, to wrestle control back from those who had tried to deceive him. Jake understood this determination, and he knew that Richard wouldn't rest until he had every answer. Jake found himself in a personal struggle as well. His loyalty to Richard was unwavering, but he couldn't deny that he felt conflicted about Emily. Despite everything, part of him wanted to believe that she hadn't meant for things to go this far. He remembered the moments he'd observed her alone, her expressions thoughtful, sometimes even sad. It was as if she'd been trapped in a role she didn't want to play, but one she felt powerless to escape. Watching Richard grapple with his emotions, Jake knew he had to set aside his own feelings. He was there to protect Richard, to uncover the truth no matter the personal cost. He knew that pursuing this path meant he would have to confront Emily directly, to find out the full extent of her involvement, and to determine if there was any hope of redemption for her, or if she had willingly chosen a path of betrayal. Later that evening, Jake confronted Emily, hoping to get answers. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but she held her ground, insisting that Matthew had threatened her, pressuring her into participating in the scheme. She spoke of debts, pressures, and a fear that had overshadowed her decisions. Jake listened, feeling a mix of sympathy and skepticism. He couldn't tell if her story was an attempt to salvage what little remained of her reputation, or if she was genuinely remorseful. The conversation left Jake with a sense of unresolved tension. He returned to Richard and relayed Emily's version of events, careful to present her words without embellishment. Richard listened, his face impassive, as Jake shared her claims of coercion and manipulation. But Jake could see that Richard wasn't swayed. The betrayal had cut too deeply, and no amount of explanation would undo the damage that had been done. Whether she was coerced or not, she still made a choice, Richard said, his voice cold and final. She chose to stand by him, to betray our life, and to risk everything I've built. There's no excuse for that. Jake understood that. For Richard, this was the ultimate betrayal, a violation of trust that would be nearly impossible to forgive. As Jake watched Richard wrestle with his emotions, he realized that the fallout of the conspiracy extended far beyond the financial losses and the public scandal. It was a personal devastation, a reminder that even the strongest people could be brought low by those they trusted most. For Richard, the journey ahead would be one of rebuilding, not just his business, but his sense of self. And Jake, committed to his role, knew he would stand by Richard's side through it all, ensuring that they both emerged from this ordeal stronger than before. Desperate and alone, Emily reached out to Jake a few days after the gala. She requested a private meeting, hoping that he would listen to her side of the story with an open mind. Jake agreed, curious to hear what she had to say, though he maintained a cautious distance. They met in a quiet cafe away from prying eyes, where Emily appeared visibly worn, a shadow of the confident woman she had once been. She looked at Jake, her eyes filled with an emotion that bordered on desperation. "He told me I'd lose everything if I didn't help him," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I was trapped. I didn't think I had any other options. By the time I realized what he was really after, it was too late. I'm not proud of what I've done, Jake, but I need you to believe that I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt Richard." Jake listened, his expression unreadable. Part of him felt sympathy for her, yet another part wondered if this was just a calculated attempt to manipulate him, to evoke his pity. He couldn't deny that she sounded sincere, but after everything he'd witnessed, he wasn't sure if he could trust her words. Returning to the mansion, Jake relayed Emily's story to Richard, laying out the details of her claims. He described how she had portrayed herself as a victim of Matthew's manipulation, someone who had been coerced into betraying her husband. Richard listened in silence, his face an impassive mask, absorbing each word without revealing his thoughts. Jake knew that Emily's explanation wouldn't erase the damage, but he also felt that Richard deserved to hear every aspect of the story, however painful it might be. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She made her choices, Jake. Whatever her reasons, she still chose to deceive me, to risk everything we built together. I don't think I can ever look at her the same way again." His words were heavy, laden with a finality that Jake knew would not easily be undone. It was clear that, for Richard, the trust that had once defined their relationship was gone, shattered beyond repair. For Jake, this moment marked a turning point. He saw the toll the betrayal had taken on Richard, the way it had stripped him of his confidence, his sense of stability. Jake realized that his role had evolved from one of mere protection to that of a confidant, a steady presence in the wake of a storm that had forever altered Richard's life. He resolved to stand by his side, to help him rebuild from the ground up, no matter how long it took. As the days passed, the tension between Jake and Richard grew palpable. While they both shared a common goal, to expose Matthew and dismantle the conspiracy, their feelings about Emily's role in it diverged. Jake found himself wrestling with a mixture of empathy and skepticism, struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one who had deceived them both. He understood Richard's anger, yet he couldn't help but feel that Emily's actions were driven by more than just malice. Perhaps she had indeed been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Richard voiced a question that had been lingering between them. "Do you think she's telling the truth, Jake? Do you think there's any chance she was manipulated, that she's not the monster she appears to be?" The question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Jake took a moment before responding. "I don't know, sir. I think she's lost, caught in something she didn't fully understand. But that doesn't change the fact that she hurt you. Whatever her reasons, she made a choice, and now she has to live with the consequences. Whether or not we believe her doesn't change what she did." Richard nodded, a look of resigned acceptance on his face. He seemed to understand that, regardless of Emily's motives, he needed to move forward, to rebuild a life that no longer included her. As they sat together in the quiet, Jake realized that they had both reached a point of no return. They had been through the fire, exposed to the darkest truths of those they trusted. And now, all that was left was to rebuild, to start anew, and to ensure that the betrayals of the past would not define the futures they were determined to reclaim. As the days turned into weeks, Richard and Jake began to shift their focus away from Emily's betrayal and toward dismantling the larger conspiracy that threatened Richard's company. They decided to join forces, pooling their resources to target the group of investors who had backed Matthew's schemes. It became clear that Matthew wasn't the only player in this game. He was merely a frontman, working for powerful figures who aimed to control Richard's empire through underhanded tactics. Richard and Jake mapped out their plan, identifying key players within the group and tracing financial transactions that tied them to Matthew. They were relentless, determined to leave no stone unturned. As they worked together, a sense of camaraderie developed between them. Richard found himself leaning on Jake, not just as an employee, but as a trusted ally, someone who had stood by him through betrayal and deception. One evening, after hours of poring over documents and strategizing, Richard turned to Jake. "You've been more than just my security detail, Jake. You've shown a loyalty I didn't expect. I'm grateful for that." Jake nodded, accepting the gratitude, but also understanding the gravity of their mission. "I'll do whatever it takes to see this through, sir. They tried to destroy you, but they underestimated us. We'll make sure they regret it." Their investigation led them to a series of high-profile meetings that Matthew had attended in secret, gatherings with influential figures who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. Jake and Richard managed to infiltrate one of these meetings, listening in from a secure vantage point. What they heard confirmed their suspicions. Matthew had been part of a larger network, a web of power-hungry individuals who were willing to go to any lengths to acquire Richard's assets. Jake documented the meeting, capturing audio and video evidence that linked these individuals to Matthew and exposed their intentions. As they gathered this proof, Richard began to see just how deep the conspiracy ran. It wasn't just about his company. It was about a group of people who thrived on dismantling others, profiting off their downfall. Realizing this made Richard even more determined to bring them down, to ensure that his life's work would not be destroyed by men who saw his achievements as mere commodities. Together, they began to contact allies in the business world, individuals who had also been targeted by this network. Through careful planning and strategic alliances, Richard and Jake started to piece together a coalition of business leaders who had fallen victim to similar schemes. With their combined resources, they aimed to take down Matthew's associates and expose the group's corruption to the public. During their investigation, Jake uncovered a personal connection that shook him. One of the investors behind the conspiracy was a former colleague of his, someone he had worked closely with in his early days as a security consultant. The man, known for his ruthless tactics, had once been a friend, a confidant Jake had trusted before their paths diverged. Learning that this old friend was part of the group targeting Richard hit close to home, forcing Jake to confront a betrayal of his own. He shared this revelation with Richard, who sensed the emotional toll it took on Jake. "You don't have to face him alone, Jake," Richard offered. "This is personal for both of us now." But Jake knew he had to confront his former colleague himself, to understand why someone he once trusted had chosen a path of deception and greed. Jake arranged a private meeting, confronting the man in a secluded office late one evening. He asked him directly why he had joined forces with Matthew, why he had chosen to betray those who had once trusted him. The man shrugged, offering no remorse. "It's just business, Jake. You should know that by now. Loyalties change, and so do the stakes. You can either adapt or get left behind." Hearing this, Jake realized that the man he once knew was gone, replaced by someone who valued power above all else. The encounter strengthened his resolve, reminding him why he had chosen to stand by Richard. He left the meeting with a renewed determination to see their mission through, to expose the entire network and protect what mattered most. As he returned to the mansion, Jake reflected on the choices he'd made. He understood now that true loyalty wasn't about convenience or gain. It was about standing by someone when it mattered most. With this conviction, he rejoined Richard, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Together, they would dismantle the conspiracy and reclaim the future that had nearly been stolen from them. With mounting evidence against Matthew and the investors, Jake discovered that the true mastermind behind the conspiracy was none other than his former colleague, Alan Winters. Alan had always been ambitious, but Jake never imagined he would go to such lengths for power and wealth. As the scope of the conspiracy became clearer, Jake and Richard decided it was time for a direct confrontation. They devised a plan to bring Alan and his associates out into the open, exposing their intentions to the world. They set up a meeting, using a business proposal as bait, to lure Alan and his co-conspirators into a secure location where Richard and Jake could control the situation. Under the guise of a business negotiation, Alan arrived, flanked by several of his key allies. They didn't suspect a thing, believing they were there to discuss Richard's company's future. Jake watched them enter, a quiet determination fueling his every move. This was his chance to confront not only Alan, but the entire network that had sought to destroy Richard's legacy. When the meeting began, Richard wasted no time. He presented Alan with the evidence Jake had gathered, laying out documents, recordings, and videos that exposed the group's plans in detail. As Richard spoke, the color drained from Alan's face, his confident demeanor slipping as he realized the trap he had walked into. "You underestimated me, Alan," Richard said, his voice steady. "You thought you could use my wife, my life, as a stepping stone for your own gain. But you were wrong." Alan attempted to defend himself, claiming that it was simply business, that Richard would have done the same in his position. But Richard shook his head, resolute. "You crossed a line, Alan. You targeted my family, manipulated my wife, and tried to dismantle everything I've built. This isn't business, it's personal." Jake then stepped forward, looking his former friend in the eye. "I trusted you once, Alan, but you chose this path, and now you have to face the consequences." Alan looked at him with a mix of anger and betrayal, realizing that Jake had been instrumental in uncovering his schemes. "You always were loyal to a fault, Jake," he sneered. "But loyalty blinds you to what's possible." Undeterred, Jake replied, "Loyalty is what keeps me standing here, while you're the one facing the fallout of your choices." The confrontation left no doubt that Alan's betrayal had not only affected Richard but also severed any ties he once shared with Jake. The weight of his actions bore down on him. As security personnel, arranged by Richard, moved to escort Alan and his associates out of the building, effectively ending their control and influence over Richard's empire. With the conspiracy unraveled, Richard turned to Jake, a look of relief mixed with exhaustion on his face. "It's over," he said quietly, though they both knew that the journey hadn't been without cost. Emily's betrayal had left a lasting scar, and the revelations about Alan had forced Jake to confront the darker sides of loyalty and friendship. But they had prevailed, exposing the corruption that threatened to destroy everything Richard had worked for. In the days that followed, Richard began the process of rebuilding, reaching out to his trusted business partners and setting his company back on a path of stability. He severed ties with anyone connected to the conspiracy, ensuring that his business would never again be vulnerable to those who valued power over integrity. Jake remained by his side, helping him restore the trust that had been so violently shaken. Though the scars remained, they both emerged from the ordeal with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to move forward with the lessons they had learned. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Richard turned to Jake, a rare smile crossing his face. "Thank you, Jake. You didn't just protect me. You reminded me of what loyalty truly means." Jake nodded, his own expression resolute. "We've been through hell, but I'd do it all again. Loyalty is earned, and you've earned mine." With that, they stood together, facing the future with a sense of hard-won resilience. They had confronted betrayal, exposed deception, and emerged stronger. And as the city lights stretched out before them, they knew that, despite the challenges they'd faced, they were prepared for whatever lay ahead. She began to tell him everything, speaking in a low voice as she recounted how she had initially become involved with Matthew. According to Emily, it all started when she discovered debts she didn't know existed, inherited from a family member. She explained that Matthew had offered to help her, claiming he could provide the financial assistance she needed. But soon, his support came with conditions, and before long, she was entangled in a scheme she had never intended to join.